Mark Pearson had never been one for the suburban dream, but when his wife Laura convinced him to leave their bustling downtown apartment and settle into a quiet neighborhood, he agreed on one condition. They would not give up their independence or their lifestyle for the sake of fitting in. Mark, a successful co-owner of one of the region's largest auto dealership chains, spent most of his life negotiating, closing deals and moving between showrooms and corporate meetings. Laura, a respected professor of American literature at a local university, was no stranger to standing her ground either. She had her passions: teaching, hiking, and, most notably, off-road driving. Her pride and joy was her heavily modified Jeep Wrangler, a vehicle she had meticulously customized over the years with lift kits, rugged tires, reinforced bumpers, and a high-performance winch. The Jeep wasn't just a car to her. It was a symbol of freedom and resilience, a machine that had carried her through the mountains of Colorado and the deserts of Arizona. When they purchased their new home, a stately two-story colonial with a wide front porch and a detached garage, Laura had every intention of continuing to drive her Jeep just as proudly as she had before. The neighborhood itself, known as Chestnut Grove, was one of those polished communities with manicured lawns, symmetrical hedges, and streets lined with aging maple trees. The houses were variations on classic American architecture, colonial revivals, Tudors, and the occasional Victorian holdover from a bygone era. Residents valued aesthetics, tradition, and, above all, uniformity. It was no secret that certain neighbors took it upon themselves to uphold the character of the community, even if their methods were more about control than care. Among these self-appointed gatekeepers was Karen Westbrook, a woman whose reputation preceded her. Karen, a widow in her early 60s with a background in municipal planning and a penchant for micromanagement, had lived on Chestnut Lane for nearly 2 decades. She chaired the unofficial Beautification Committee and was known for her relentless enforcement of unwritten neighborhood standards. From issuing polite but pointed notes about mailbox colors to outright confronting new residents about their choice of landscaping, Karen operated with an air of entitled authority that few dared to challenge. Mark and Laura had been warned by their realtor about the local watchdog, but neither of them was particularly concerned. They were law-abiding, respectful homeowners with no interest in disrupting the peace. However, as Mark would later reflect, it didn't take much to offend those who thrived on control. The spark that ignited the coming conflict was as mundane as it was inevitable. One crisp Saturday afternoon, Laura returned from a weekend trip to the Appalachian trails, her Jeep coated in a satisfying layer of mud and dust, the aftermath of conquering rocky paths and river fords. She parked the vehicle on the public street in front of their house, a perfectly legal space shared by all residents of Chestnut Lane. The following morning, as she stepped outside to collect the newspaper, Laura found Karen standing on the sidewalk, arms crossed, eyes locked on the Jeep with a look of utter disdain. "Good morning," Laura greeted politely, sensing the tension but unwilling to engage in hostility. Karen did not return the pleasantry. Instead, she launched into an unsolicited monologue about neighborhood values and the importance of maintaining a visually harmonious streetscape. She pointedly described Laura's Jeep as an eyesore and suggested that vehicles of such a utilitarian and aggressive nature were better suited to service roads, not the genteel avenues of Chestnut Grove. Laura, maintaining her composure, calmly explained that her Jeep was legally parked and that she had no intention of moving it until she chose to do so. That was when Karen issued her thinly veiled threat. "If you don't take care of it, I will," she said, her voice laced with an unsettling certainty. When Laura recounted the encounter to Mark that evening, he chuckled at first, brushing it off as the meddling of a bored retiree. "Let her bark," he said. "We've dealt with bigger sharks." But Laura, perceptive as ever, sensed a deeper undercurrent. Karen wasn't just venting frustration. She was laying the groundwork for action. True to form, the next morning brought the first tangible sign that Karen was escalating. Affixed to the Jeep's windshield was a bright orange sticker from a private towing company. one not affiliated with the city. The sticker declared the vehicle abandoned and scheduled for removal within 48 hours. The language was aggressive and legally dubious, clearly intended to intimidate. Mark immediately checked their security cameras. Sure enough, the footage showed a man in an unmarked van arriving late at night, photographing the Jeep from multiple angles and applying the sticker with methodical precision. Now it was Mark's turn to take the situation seriously. He wasn't about to let anyone interfere with their property or bully his wife. He made a few calls to contacts in the auto industry and quickly confirmed that the towing company in question was known for skirting legal boundaries, often contracted by private individuals seeking to circumvent municipal procedures. This was no official city action. It was a personal vendetta. The realization infuriated Mark, but he remained level-headed. He advised Laura not to remove the sticker herself, a common mistake that could be twisted into an admission of wrongdoing. Instead, he contacted the city's Parking Enforcement Division and requested an official inspection. Within hours, a uniformed officer arrived, inspected the Jeep, and issued a written statement confirming that the vehicle was legally parked and that no violations had occurred. With that foundation laid, Mark documented everything: photos of the Jeep's position, screenshots of the security footage, and a copy of the officer's report. He wasn't preparing for a fight. He was preparing for a legal defense. When he later spoke to their attorney, a seasoned professional who handled risk management for his dealership network, the advice was clear. Don't engage emotionally. Document, escalate through proper channels, and use your leverage wisely. What Mark hadn't anticipated was how quickly Karen would double down. The very next day, Laura overheard her on the phone, speaking loudly enough from her porch that the entire block could hear, boasting about her plans to restore order to the street. Several neighbors glanced nervously at one another but remained silent. Karen's influence, it seemed, extended beyond her committee role. She knew how to apply pressure, and she was not above using social leverage to isolate her targets. Within 48 hours, 2 anonymous complaints were filed with the neighborhood council, citing the Jeep as a nuisance vehicle and alleging that it disrupted the visual cohesion of the block. Though the council had no legal authority to enforce parking rules on public streets, they forwarded the complaints to City Hall in an attempt to provoke municipal action. Mark was unimpressed. He had dealt with worse in the corporate world. What troubled him more was the realization that Karen's tactics were systematic. She wasn't acting alone. She was mobilizing a small but vocal faction of like-minded residents. The situation was no longer about one Jeep. It was about control, precedent, and the ability to dictate who belonged and who didn't. Over dinner that week, Mark and Laura weighed their options. They could fight each complaint individually, engaging in a protracted war of attrition, or they could seize the initiative and make a bold, undeniable statement that would reframe the conflict on their terms. Mark chose the latter. Leveraging his dealership's promotional resources, he devised a plan that was both strategic and entirely legal. He filed an application with the city for a temporary promotional display permit, a common practice used during community festivals and charity events. The permit, once approved, would allow him to stage a week-long showcase of new SUV and truck models along Chestnut Lane, complete with signage and staffed representatives. Every vehicle would be properly registered, insured, and parked within legal parameters. It was not an act of retaliation, Mark insisted to Laura, but a demonstration of their right to occupy shared public space without intimidation. As the permit process moved forward, word of Mark's plan began to circulate. Reactions were mixed. Some neighbors, weary of Karen's heavy-handedness, quietly expressed support. Others, fearful of drawing her ire, remained non-committal. For her part, Karen reacted with predictable outrage, sending a flurry of emails to the council and city officials, decrying the commercialization of the street. But Mark's paperwork was flawless, and the city, bound by its own ordinances, had no grounds to deny the permit. By the time the week of the display arrived, tensions on Chestnut Lane were palpable. Shiny new SUVs and off-road trucks lined the curb, their polished exteriors gleaming under the autumn sun. Promotional banners fluttered tastefully above the display, and a small team of dealership staff managed the setup with professional courtesy. Far from disrupting the neighborhood, the event attracted curiosity and admiration from passers-by. Ironically, it was Karen's own street that now bore the spotlight she had sought to avoid. Yet for Mark, the display was only the beginning. He understood that true resolution would require more than a show of force. It would require exposing the pattern of abuse for what it was. With his attorney's guidance, he began compiling a comprehensive dossier of Karen's actions, from the unauthorized towing attempt to the coordinated complaints and public harassment. Every step was documented, every line crossed meticulously recorded. If Karen wished to escalate further, she would soon find herself facing not just a community backlash, but potential legal consequences. As the sun set over the rows of gleaming vehicles, Mark stood on his porch with Laura, watching the subtle shift in the neighborhood's mood. Neighbors who had once avoided eye contact now offered nods of quiet approval. The message was clear. Intimidation had met its match. The battle for Chestnut Lane was far from over, but for the first time since moving in, Mark and Laura felt the ground shifting beneath their feet, away from fear and toward resolve. The days that followed the promotional display on Chestnut Lane were deceptively calm. The vehicles had been removed as scheduled, the permit period had expired without issue, and for a brief moment Mark and Laura entertained the hope that the message had been received. Perhaps Karen, faced with legal pushback and a visible show of strength, would retreat into the shadows. But if Mark had learned anything from his years negotiating in the auto industry, it was that some adversaries did not relent when confronted. They adapted, regrouped, and struck from new angles. And Karen, it seemed, was such an adversary. It began subtly. A notice from the city arrived in the mail, an official-looking envelope bearing the seal of the Municipal Code Enforcement Office. Inside was a citation addressed to Mark personally, alleging that his dealership had conducted an unauthorized commercial event on a residential street. The language was carefully chosen, vague enough to imply wrongdoing but lacking any concrete violation. Attached was a fine. Not an outrageous amount, but enough to signal that someone had stirred the pot at City Hall. Mark's initial reaction was a mix of annoyance and professional curiosity. The permit for the display had been properly filed, the event had been conducted within the legal window, and all paperwork was on record. This citation had no legal foundation, and he knew it. But the appearance of the notice confirmed that Karen had escalated the conflict to a new level, one that reached beyond Chestnut Lane and into the bureaucratic machinery of the city itself. Mark wasted no time. He forwarded the citation to his attorney, along with copies of the permit, photographs of the event setup, and correspondence with city officials. The response was swift. The citation was baseless and would be formally contested. Still, the incident served as a reminder that Karen was not operating in isolation. Someone within City Hall had been persuaded, whether through influence, misinformation, or simple nuisance pressure, to take action. The battle had moved from the street to the regulatory arena. Laura, meanwhile, faced her own front. An anonymous email was forwarded to the dean of her department at the university. The message, thinly veiled in concern for professional conduct, accused Laura of participating in an inappropriate commercial stunt and questioned whether her public actions reflected the values of the institution. Though the dean knew Laura well and treated the accusation with the skepticism it deserved, she was nonetheless obligated to inform Laura of the complaint and request a written response. When Laura shared the news with Mark over dinner, her frustration was palpable. "She's trying to drag my career into this," Laura said, her voice tight. "This has nothing to do with my job." Mark nodded grimly. "She's trying to make it personal, because she can't win on the street." It was clear that Karen was escalating on multiple fronts, using every lever of influence she could muster. The next blow came in the form of a visit from an insurance adjuster. A representative from the commercial insurance carrier that covered Mark's dealership network arrived at his office unannounced, citing a routine review triggered by a community complaint. The complaint, as it turned out, alleged that dealership vehicles had been operated in a manner inconsistent with their insured use, specifically referencing the recent street display. Though the adjuster was professional and non-confrontational, the implication was clear. Someone was attempting to disrupt the financial underpinnings of Mark's business. Once again, Mark responded methodically. He provided the adjuster with full documentation of the permitted event, the relevant insurance riders, and a detailed timeline. There was no violation, and the adjuster, after reviewing the materials, agreed. Still, the pattern was unmistakable. Karen had broadened her campaign, seeking to apply pressure wherever she could. It was no longer just about the Jeep or the aesthetics of the neighborhood. It was about leverage, about forcing Mark and Laura into submission through attrition. The final confirmation came through an unexpected source. One evening, as Mark was reviewing dealership reports in his home office, the doorbell rang. At the threshold stood Richard Carmichael, a retired attorney who lived 3 houses down. Richard was known for his reserved demeanor and generally kept to himself, but tonight he seemed uncharacteristically animated. After exchanging pleasantries, Richard got to the point. "I thought you should know," he said, lowering his voice. "Karen's been organizing an informal petition. She's going door to door, telling people you're turning the street into a commercial zone. She's trying to get enough signatures to force a special council hearing." Mark leaned back in his chair, absorbing the news. "And people are signing?" "Some," Richard admitted. "Most are just humoring her to avoid conflict. But the point is, she's building a paper trail." Mark thanked Richard sincerely. The information confirmed what he already suspected. The conflict was escalating beyond the immediate circle of those involved. Karen was attempting to manufacture consensus, to create a facade of community outrage that could be weaponized at the municipal level. At this point, Mark faced a choice. He could continue responding defensively, reacting to each new provocation as it arose, or he could shift the dynamic entirely, take the initiative, and redefine the battleground. He chose the latter. The following morning, he convened a meeting with his legal team and a trusted public relations consultant who had handled sensitive cases for the dealership in the past. The strategy they devised was both simple and powerful: transparency and escalation through official channels. Every complaint, every incident, every falsehood would be documented and addressed publicly. If Karen wished to wage a bureaucratic war, Mark would meet her on that field, but he would do so with overwhelming force and meticulous preparation. The first step was a formal letter to the city attorney's office, outlining the pattern of harassment and the documented misuse of municipal processes. The letter was accompanied by a comprehensive dossier: security footage of the unauthorized towing attempt, copies of the baseless citation, records of the insurance inquiry, and transcripts of the university complaint. The tone was measured but firm, an assertion of rights, a defense of lawful conduct, and a clear warning against further abuse of authority. Simultaneously, Mark's PR consultant prepared a community briefing, a factual summary of the events, devoid of rhetoric, intended for distribution to neighbors and relevant city officials. The goal was not to inflame public opinion, but to anchor the narrative in verifiable facts and to position Mark and Laura as responsible, law-abiding citizens defending their rights against unwarranted aggression. As these actions unfolded, the atmosphere on Chestnut Lane grew tense. Some neighbors, previously silent, began to approach Mark and Laura discreetly, offering words of support or expressing frustration with Karen's tactics. The tide, it seemed, was beginning to turn, though the outcome remained uncertain. Mark understood that the coming weeks would be critical. Karen had demonstrated a willingness to exploit every avenue available, and he had no illusions that she would back down easily. But for the first time since the conflict began, he felt they were no longer reacting. They were shaping the battlefield, setting the terms of engagement. The battle for Chestnut Lane was entering a new phase, and Mark was determined to see it through, not just for the sake of one Jeep, but for the principle that no one, however entrenched, had the right to wield fear as a tool of control. If Mark Pearson thought the formal letter to the city attorney and the carefully prepared community briefing would slow Karen's momentum, the coming weeks quickly disabused him of that notion. Rather than retreat, Karen adapted. She was no fool. Years of bureaucratic maneuvering, both in her former professional life and through her long tenure in neighborhood circles, had taught her how to shift tactics when direct confrontation failed. The first sign came not through official channels, but in the subtle shifts in the behavior of certain neighbors. Invitations that had previously arrived in the Pearsons' mailbox, block parties, committee meetings, charity bake sales, suddenly ceased. Laura noticed it first, commenting one evening over dinner that several women from the neighborhood had stopped acknowledging her entirely. Conversations at the local coffee shop grew abruptly quiet when she entered. It was a classic form of social pressure, the kind designed not to provoke a legal response but to instill discomfort, to encourage isolation. Mark remained calm. He reminded Laura that such tactics were to be expected, and that they would not waver in the face of them. What concerned him more was what arrived next. A letter from a local law firm representing the so-called Chestnut Grove Neighborhood Improvement Group, a body that Mark had never heard of, and that, on closer inspection, appeared to be little more than a shell created by Karen and a handful of allies. The letter was couched in polite legalese but was unmistakably threatening. It alleged that Mark's actions, specifically the street display and his public responses to Karen's complaints, constituted a pattern of conduct that may be construed as harassment under local statutes. The letter demanded an immediate cessation of all publicly disruptive activity and threatened civil action should Mark fail to comply. This was a new front, an attempt to flip the narrative and paint Mark as the aggressor. It was an audacious move, but a shrewd one, designed to place him on the defensive and to sow doubt among any wavering neighbors or city officials. Mark's attorney, after a thorough review, was unimpressed. The claims were without merit, unsupported by fact or law. But the letter itself served a purpose. It was a seed, a document that Karen could point to in her ongoing campaign, saying, "Look, even the lawyers say he's a problem." It was classic reputational warfare. Mark responded exactly as advised, formally through his attorney, with a detailed rebuttal that not only refuted the claims but documented the context of each cited incident. At the same time, he took a crucial next step. He authorized his legal team to file a notice of intent regarding potential defamation and abuse of process. The notice was not a lawsuit, but it was a clear signal that further false claims could result in real legal consequences. It was a carefully measured escalation, one that demonstrated resolve without overcommitting. Even as these legal maneuvers played out, Karen escalated in other ways. A series of anonymous complaints began flooding the city's parking enforcement office, alleging that the Jeep was frequently parked in violation of street cleaning schedules, blocking access for emergency vehicles, or otherwise creating hazards. Each complaint triggered an inspection, and though none resulted in a citation, Mark had been meticulous about compliance, the cumulative effect was to generate a file, a paper trail that could be misrepresented to city officials less familiar with the facts. It was around this time that the attacks took a more personal turn. Late one evening, as Mark reviewed dealership inventory reports, his phone buzzed with an email notification, an alert from one of the professional reputation monitoring services he subscribed to as part of his corporate risk management strategy. The alert flagged a sudden spike in online chatter involving his name and that of his dealership. Curious, Mark clicked through. On a local community forum, one frequented by Chestnut Grove residents, an anonymous user had posted a lengthy diatribe accusing Mark of exploiting legal loopholes to commercialize residential spaces and of intimidating neighbors through corporate muscle. The post was riddled with inaccuracies and outright falsehoods, but was artfully written to sound credible to those unfamiliar with the details. Worse, it had begun to attract comments, some skeptical, others alarmingly supportive. Laura, reading over Mark's shoulder, let out a frustrated sigh. "She's trying to poison the well," she said. "Even if people don't believe all of it, the damage is done." Mark nodded grimly. He knew reputation management better than most. In business, perception often mattered as much as fact, and Karen understood this well. But he also knew that countering such tactics required a steady hand. Reacting emotionally would only feed the narrative. Instead, Mark coordinated with his PR consultant to prepare a factual public statement, one that clarified the events and reaffirmed their commitment to lawful and respectful community engagement. The statement was circulated through the same forum, and though it didn't erase the falsehoods, it provided a clear alternative for those seeking the truth. Meanwhile, the practical pressures continued to mount. Mark's insurance broker informed him of an unexpected audit request from one of the underwriters. Officially, it was framed as a routine review, but off the record, the broker admitted that it had been triggered by yet another anonymous complaint. The pattern was undeniable. Karen, or someone acting on her behalf, was probing for weaknesses, looking for any lever that could be pulled to create financial or operational strain. Mark responded as he had to each prior challenge, with thorough preparation and scrupulous compliance. His records were impeccable, and the audit, though time-consuming, ultimately yielded no adverse findings. Still, the cumulative effect was undeniable. The campaign was consuming time, energy, and resources, all by design. Amidst this siege, an unexpected development occurred, one that subtly shifted the dynamics of the neighborhood. One evening, as Mark and Laura returned from dinner, they found a sealed envelope taped to their front door. Inside was a handwritten note, unsigned, but clearly from a sympathetic neighbor. The note acknowledged the tension on the street, expressed support for the Pearsons' stance, and warned that Karen was planning to push for a formal vote at the next city council meeting, one that, if successful, would recommend the designation of Chestnut Lane as a special character zone, a status that could impose stricter aesthetic and usage regulations. The revelation was both troubling and galvanizing. Mark realized that Karen was playing the long game, seeking to institutionalize her control through official policy. If the designation passed, it could provide a legal framework for the very restrictions she had been trying to impose informally. The stakes had just been raised. Without hesitation, Mark convened another strategy session with his legal and PR teams. They developed a multi-pronged response. First, a direct outreach campaign to city council members, ensuring they were fully briefed on the true nature of the conflict and the risks of codifying one faction's aesthetic preferences into law. Second, information campaign targeted at the broader neighborhood, highlighting the potential unintended consequences of such a designation, reduced property flexibility, potential devaluation, and increased regulatory burden. Simultaneously, Mark began quietly building alliances. He reached out to other residents, those who valued personal freedom over rigid uniformity, and engaged them in candid conversations about the broader implications of Karen's campaign. The response was encouraging. While some remained wary of open conflict, many shared Mark's concerns and were willing to lend quiet support. As the date of the council meeting approached, the tension on Chestnut Lane was palpable. The battle lines had been drawn, not through open confrontation, but through a steady accretion of legal filings, bureaucratic skirmishes, and social maneuvering. Mark understood that the coming weeks would be decisive. This was no longer a personal dispute over a parked Jeep. It was a contest for the character of the neighborhood itself, for the principle that no resident, however entrenched, had the right to dictate terms to an entire community. And in that contest, Mark was prepared to fight, not with bluster or bravado, but with the tools of law, reason, and unshakable resolve. The escalation had begun in earnest, and he would meet it on every front. The evening of the city council meeting arrived with a tense undercurrent that was almost palpable throughout Chestnut Lane. Word had spread that the proposed special character zone designation for their street was not merely a benign aesthetic guideline, but a potentially restrictive policy that could open the door to a host of new regulations. ones that would give Karen and her allies tangible authority to enforce their vision of neighborhood conformity. Mark Pearson, well aware of the stakes, had spent the preceding days in quiet but determined preparation. He had met individually with several council members, presenting them with a meticulously organized binder of documentation, evidence of Karen's orchestrated harassment, records of the legitimate permits for the vehicle display, and letters of support from a growing number of residents who valued their personal freedoms over an artificially imposed uniformity. Laura, for her part, had faced her own internal battle. The stress of the ongoing conflict had begun to wear on her, not least because it had touched her professional life. Yet she remained resolute, her pride in her Jeep now intertwined with a broader commitment to standing against the coercive tactics that had plagued their street. On the night of the meeting, she accompanied Mark to City Hall, her presence a quiet but powerful statement of solidarity. The council chambers were packed, a rare occurrence for such municipal proceedings. Familiar faces from Chestnut Lane filled the seats, their expressions ranging from anxious to defiant. Karen sat near the front, flanked by a small contingent of her most loyal supporters, her demeanor one of cool confidence. Mark and Laura took seats midway back, accompanied by Richard Carmichael, the retired attorney who had become an unexpected ally, and a few other neighbors who had stepped forward in recent weeks to offer support. When the agenda item was introduced, Karen rose to speak first. She delivered a carefully rehearsed address, her tone measured, her words couched in the language of community values and preservation. She spoke of protecting the historical character of Chestnut Lane, of ensuring that commercial interests do not erode the integrity of our shared space. She made veiled references to recent unfortunate incidents without naming Mark directly, but leaving no doubt as to her intended target. The presentation was polished, the narrative artfully constructed to sway those unfamiliar with the deeper context. But as Karen concluded and returned to her seat, the room shifted. Mark rose, carrying with him the binder of evidence. His voice was steady, devoid of the emotional charge that Karen had subtly woven into her remarks. He began by acknowledging the value of community standards but quickly pivoted to the core issue: the line between personal preference and enforceable regulation, the dangers of codifying one viewpoint into law. He presented the facts with precision: permitted events, documented harassment, the misuse of city processes, and underscored the broader implications of the proposed designation. A chilling effect on personal freedoms, the risk of divisive enforcement, and the potential devaluation of property due to restrictive covenants. Mark's presentation was followed by a series of public comments. To his quiet satisfaction, several neighbors who had previously remained silent now stepped forward. One spoke of the importance of maintaining the street's welcoming character for diverse lifestyles. Another recounted concerns about property rights and the precedent such a designation could set. The tide of the room was visibly turning. Yet the pivotal moment came from an unexpected quarter. A council member, known for her impartiality and legal rigor, posed a pointed question to the city's legal advisor. Given the documented history of harassment and the contentious nature of this proposal, would enacting such a designation expose the city to potential legal challenges on the grounds of selective enforcement or abuse of process? The advisor, after a careful pause, acknowledged that the risk was non-trivial. The statement hung in the air, a subtle but decisive blow to Karen's campaign. When the matter was finally called to a vote, the result was clear. The proposal failed to pass, falling short by a significant margin. A murmur rippled through the chamber, a mixture of relief and restrained triumph among those who had opposed the measure. Karen, for the first time in weeks, appeared visibly unsettled. Her mask of control had cracked, however slightly. In the days that followed, the atmosphere on Chestnut Lane shifted perceptibly. The failure of the designation had not ended the conflict, but it had altered the balance of power. Karen's aura of inevitability was diminished, her influence no longer unassailable. Mark and Laura found themselves receiving quiet words of encouragement from neighbors who had previously kept their distance. The social isolation began to thaw, yet Mark remained vigilant. He understood that Karen's defeat at the council was unlikely to mark the end of her campaign. She had invested too much, her sense of authority too deeply entwined with the control she sought to exert. If anything, her tactics would likely evolve, becoming more subtle, perhaps more personal. But now, armed with public validation and a strengthened network of allies, Mark felt more prepared than ever to meet whatever came next. The middle point of their battle had been reached. The lines were clearer, the stakes higher, and the resolve on both sides hardening. What had begun as a dispute over a parked Jeep had become a defining struggle for the character of a community, and neither side showed any sign of backing down. The defeat of Karen's initiative at the city council meeting marked a turning point, but it did not mark the end of the battle. If anything, the loss appeared to galvanize her further. For a few days after the vote, Chestnut Lane settled into an uneasy calm. Karen was conspicuously absent from her usual patrols along the sidewalk, her meticulously timed morning walks suspended. There were no emails or committee notices from her, no neighborhood flyers slipped into mailboxes. Mark Pearson was under no illusion that this was surrender. Rather, it was the pause of an opponent regrouping, recalibrating her strategy after an unexpected setback. The storm, he sensed, was not over. It was merely shifting direction. The first indication of the new phase came in the form of a thick packet of documents delivered to Mark's dealership offices rather than to his home. The sender was a regional environmental review group that Mark's company occasionally dealt with in the context of large-scale lot expansions. The documents included a notice of investigation, triggered by an anonymous report alleging that Mark's dealerships were contributing to environmental degradation through improper handling of automotive waste, specifically citing runoff concerns related to recent vehicle displays, an obvious reference to the Chestnut Lane event. The language was couched in standard regulatory phrasing, but the timing and specificity made its origins unmistakable. Mark understood immediately what this represented. Karen had expanded her campaign beyond the neighborhood, reaching into the regulatory frameworks that governed his business operations. It was a smart move on her part. While the neighborhood battle had been largely a political and social skirmish, this new front introduced potential legal and financial liabilities. Regulatory inquiries, even when unfounded, consumed resources and attention, potentially sowing doubt among business partners and insurers. He responded as he always did, with calm precision. His legal and compliance teams were activated, audits were conducted preemptively, and detailed reports were prepared to demonstrate adherence to all applicable regulations. The initial review found no violations, and Mark's team was confident that any official inquiry would ultimately clear them. Still, the message was clear. Karen was willing to escalate beyond personal grievances, leveraging institutional mechanisms to apply pressure. Meanwhile, Laura faced a fresh wave of professional interference. Another anonymous complaint was lodged with the university, this time accompanied by a packet of selectively edited forum posts and out-of-context email excerpts purporting to show her involvement in organized intimidation of neighbors. The materials were transparently fabricated, but the university's legal department, bound by protocol, initiated a review. The process, though unlikely to result in any formal action, nevertheless placed an unwelcome burden on Laura, forcing her to divert time and energy to defending her reputation. Mark and Laura both recognized the pattern. Karen had moved from direct confrontation to a war of attrition. Small, cumulative attacks designed to exhaust their resources and resolve. The question was how far she would go and how best to counter this new phase. The answer came unexpectedly from within the neighborhood itself. One rainy afternoon, Mark received a call from Richard Carmichael. The retired attorney had continued to monitor developments and had uncovered a curious detail. Karen had recently been in frequent contact with a local property management consultant known for aggressive code enforcement strategies. Through his contacts, Richard learned that Karen was preparing to initiate a series of private code violation reports targeting not only Mark's property but several others on the street, homes that, for one reason or another, had run afoul of her aesthetic standards. This revelation was significant. It indicated that Karen's campaign was expanding beyond her personal vendetta against the Pearsons. She was seeking to consolidate control by bringing others under scrutiny, thereby isolating dissenters and reinforcing her authority. If successful, this strategy could fracture the nascent coalition that had begun to form in opposition to her influence. Mark recognized the urgency of the situation. He convened a discreet meeting with several of the more moderate neighbors, those who valued community harmony but had grown increasingly uncomfortable with Karen's tactics. The goal was not to form a formal opposition group, which would risk further polarization, but to establish a quiet network of communication and mutual support. The meeting, held at a local cafe away from the neighborhood, was productive. Several residents expressed relief at the opportunity to compare notes and share concerns. Importantly, they agreed to coordinate responses to any new code enforcement actions and to document all interactions with city officials for potential legal review. As this network solidified, Karen made her next move. Without warning, a contractor appeared on Chestnut Lane and began marking the curbs in front of several homes, including the Pearsons, with bright yellow paint. Notices were posted on doors, citing upcoming sidewalk conformity inspections, ordered in response to reported hazards. The tactic was transparent, an attempt to manufacture violations where none existed, triggering costly remediation or fines. Mark responded immediately. His attorney contacted the city's Public Works Department to confirm the legitimacy of the inspections. It quickly became apparent that the orders had been prompted by Karen's persistent complaints, which, while technically allowable, lacked the substantiating evidence required for enforcement. Armed with this information, Mark coordinated with the other targeted homeowners to file formal objections and demand a review of the complaint process. At the same time, Mark's PR consultant recommended a strategic communication initiative, not confrontational, but designed to shift the broader narrative. Working with the neighborhood's more reasonable voices, they prepared a series of op-eds and community forum posts emphasizing the importance of fair governance, transparency, and respect for diverse lifestyles within Chestnut Grove. The messaging was subtle but effective, fostering a sense of shared values that stood in contrast to Karen's authoritarian approach. As the weeks progressed, the cumulative effect of these efforts began to show. The city quietly suspended the sidewalk inspections pending review, and the university concluded its inquiry into Laura without finding cause for action. The environmental review also moved toward closure, with preliminary findings indicating full compliance. Karen, despite her efforts, was encountering institutional resistance as her pattern of complaints became more apparent to officials. Yet, just as Mark allowed himself a moment of cautious optimism, a new and deeply personal blow was delivered. One evening, after returning from a dealership board meeting, Mark found an unmarked envelope in his home mailbox. Inside was a series of candid photographs, images of Laura entering and exiting the university, shopping, walking the dog, accompanied by a chilling note. Some of us care about the integrity of our community. Maybe it's time to think about your choices. This was no longer bureaucratic harassment. It was intimidation, plain and simple. Mark's reaction was immediate and unequivocal. He contacted the police, filed a report, and provided them with the photographs and envelope. He also informed his attorney, who initiated an independent investigation through a private security firm. The escalation into personal surveillance crossed a line, transforming the conflict from a civil dispute into a matter of safety. News of the incident, though initially kept quiet, soon spread among the core group of supportive neighbors. The reaction was swift and largely sympathetic. Even those who had remained neutral began to question the morality of Karen's campaign. The social calculus of Chestnut Lane was shifting. Karen's actions, once perceived as eccentric but within the bounds of community activism, were now viewed by many as dangerous and unacceptable. Mark, for his part, remained outwardly composed but deeply resolved. The second escalation had revealed the full extent of Karen's willingness to use intimidation and institutional manipulation to achieve her ends. It had also exposed the fragility of her support, which was increasingly contingent on silence rather than conviction. As the investigation into the surveillance incident unfolded, Mark prepared for the next phase. He understood that the conflict was no longer confined to Chestnut Lane or even to the bounds of neighborhood politics. It had become a broader struggle over the principles of lawful conduct, personal freedom, and the limits of community governance. And in that struggle, Mark was more determined than ever to prevail, not through force, but through unyielding adherence to the law, strategic clarity, and the quiet strength of those who had chosen to stand with him. The battle was far from over. If anything, it had entered its most dangerous stage. But Mark Pearson, having faced down greater challenges in the cutthroat world of business, was not about to be intimidated. The second escalation had only steeled his resolve. The weeks following the discovery of the surveillance photographs were among the most tense that Mark and Laura had faced since moving to Chestnut Lane. The act of being watched, of having one's private routines documented without consent, marked a dark, new threshold in the ongoing conflict. Though Mark had engaged the police and a private security firm, results were slow in coming. Whoever had followed Laura had taken pains to avoid easy identification. No license plates were visible in any surrounding footage. No obvious connection to Karen or her known allies could yet be established. Still, the circumstantial evidence was strong enough that the police treated the incident seriously. Patrol presence in the neighborhood increased subtly, and Mark took additional precautions, installing enhanced surveillance around both his home and the dealership offices. Meanwhile, Karen's campaign was showing signs of strain. The blatant escalation to personal intimidation had fractured her remaining base of neighborhood support. Rumors circulated that several members of her closest circle had distanced themselves, unwilling to be associated with tactics that many now viewed as crossing a moral line. At the same time, city officials, already wary from the failed special zoning initiative, began scrutinizing new complaints from Karen's camp with increased skepticism. Mark's legal team quietly coordinated with the city attorney to ensure that any further misuse of municipal processes would be promptly documented for potential civil action. But Karen, though wounded, was not yet defeated. Having seen her public and bureaucratic avenues stall, she turned to subtler forms of influence. Through private channels, she attempted to rally a last-ditch effort among a small group of neighbors to push for a restrictive parking ordinance that, while nominally applying to the entire block, would disproportionately impact vehicles like Laura's Jeep. The proposal, framed as a safety measure to ensure clear access for emergency services, was to be introduced at an upcoming Public Safety Committee hearing, a venue less visible than the full council and one where Karen still maintained some influence. Mark learned of the plan through Richard Carmichael, whose network of former legal colleagues kept him well informed of local political maneuvers. The proposed ordinance, while not illegal, represented a calculated effort to achieve through technical regulation what Karen had failed to impose through direct zoning changes. If passed, it would effectively force Laura to either remove her Jeep from street parking entirely or face repeated fines. Recognizing the threat, Mark moved swiftly. His attorney drafted a detailed legal analysis of the proposed ordinance, highlighting its discriminatory intent and potential conflicts with existing state transportation codes. Simultaneously, Mark's PR consultant prepared a community outreach campaign to raise awareness of the ordinance's true implications. Flyers were distributed discreetly, and personal conversations with key residents helped build a quiet but resolute coalition against the measure. Laura, despite the emotional toll of recent weeks, chose to speak publicly at the hearing. Her testimony was calm, articulate, and deeply personal. She spoke not only of her own experiences but of the broader principle at stake, the right of residents to live free from targeted harassment and arbitrary restrictions. Her words resonated with many in attendance, including several committee members who had initially viewed the ordinance as a routine procedural matter. The hearing proved to be the tipping point. Faced with a well-prepared opposition and growing public unease over the increasingly personal nature of the conflict, the committee tabled the ordinance indefinitely. The decision was a clear defeat for Karen, one that unfolded in a forum where her remaining influence had once seemed strongest. In the aftermath, a remarkable shift occurred within the neighborhood. Several residents who had remained neutral or even mildly supportive of Karen's earlier efforts now began to speak out against her tactics. An informal neighborhood forum, previously dominated by a small clique, saw a surge of new voices advocating for fairness, transparency, and mutual respect. The atmosphere on Chestnut Lane began to thaw, the shadow of intimidation lifting, if only gradually. Yet the true culmination of the conflict came not through a single public defeat, but through the accumulation of legal and social consequences that Karen's actions had set in motion. The ongoing police investigation into the surveillance incident, while not yet conclusively tied to Karen, continued to gather momentum. Simultaneously, Mark's legal team finalized a civil action strategy, preparing to file suit for defamation, abuse of process, and intentional infliction of emotional distress, should further provocations occur. Word of these preparations inevitably reached Karen. Whether through mutual acquaintances or legal channels, she became aware that the next escalation would not be hers to control. Confronted with diminishing support, increasing legal exposure, and a community no longer willing to turn a blind eye, Karen began to withdraw. Her public appearances became infrequent. Her once dominant presence in neighborhood affairs reduced to sporadic emails and the occasional curt reply on community forums. For Mark and Laura, the culmination was marked less by triumph than by a hard-earned restoration of normalcy. The Jeep once again occupied its familiar place on the street, now a quiet symbol of resilience rather than a flashpoint of controversy. The neighborhood, though still healing, had reclaimed a measure of balance, and Mark, ever pragmatic, knew that vigilance would remain necessary. The scars of the conflict would not fade overnight, nor would Karen's capacity for disruption vanish entirely. But in the measured judgment of the Pearsons and their allies, the decisive battle had been won, not through force or public spectacle, but through patient, principled resistance, strategic clarity, and the quiet courage to stand firm when it mattered most. In the weeks following the failed ordinance hearing, the mood on Chestnut Lane shifted in ways both subtle and profound. What had once been a neighborhood fractured by tension and suspicion began, slowly, to mend. Conversations that had all but vanished during the height of the conflict resumed, tentative at first, then with growing warmth. Neighbors who had kept their distance from Mark and Laura began to reappear, some with quiet apologies, others with gestures of solidarity that spoke louder than words. The Jeep remained parked in its rightful place, its presence no longer a source of whispered controversy but rather a quiet testament to perseverance and principle. Mark and Laura, though still cautious, found themselves once again able to enjoy their home and their street without the constant undercurrent of hostility. Karen, by contrast, had become a diminished figure. The informal networks that had once amplified her influence were now fractured, many of her former allies unwilling to risk further association. Her emails to the neighborhood mailing list grew increasingly sporadic and were often met with silence or polite but non-committal responses. The public exposure of her tactics, combined with the very real legal scrutiny now surrounding her actions, had eroded the authority she once wielded so confidently. Though she remained in her home, her presence was no longer dominant. The balance of power within the community had shifted decisively. For Mark and Laura, the resolution of the conflict brought not celebration, but a measured sense of closure. They understood that victory in this context was not about defeating an opponent in dramatic fashion, but about reclaiming the ordinary freedoms that should never have been threatened in the first place. It was about restoring the ability to live one's life without undue interference, to park a beloved vehicle without the fear of retribution, to walk through one's own neighborhood without the weight of constant vigilance. It was about ensuring that the principles of fairness and respect remained stronger than the forces of control and intimidation. Mark remained pragmatic. He knew that while the most overt phases of the conflict had ended, the potential for lingering tensions remained. He maintained open lines of communication with his legal team, ensuring that any future provocations would be met with swift and decisive action. The police investigation into the surveillance incident remained active, and Mark followed its progress closely, determined to see accountability pursued wherever the evidence led. Yet, even as he remained vigilant, he also sought to foster a renewed spirit of community on Chestnut Lane. With the encouragement of several neighbors, he began participating in small, informal gatherings, barbecues, book clubs, casual coffee meetups, events aimed not at relitigating the past, but at rebuilding trust and neighborly goodwill. Laura, too, found a new equilibrium. The support she had received during the later stages of the conflict had bolstered her confidence, and she returned to her professional life with renewed focus. The university's handling of the false complaints had been both thorough and fair, and Laura's standing within her department remained strong. Her Jeep, once a symbol of defiance, now served simply as what it had always been to her, a beloved vehicle, a means of adventure, a part of her identity embraced without apology. Perhaps the most telling sign of change came not from formal victories or public acknowledgments, but from the quiet moments of daily life. When Laura returned from a weekend trip one crisp Saturday afternoon, parking her Jeep in its familiar spot, she was greeted not by glares or silence, but by a friendly wave from a neighbor across the street. Later that evening, as Mark took the dog for a walk, he was stopped by another resident who remarked on the welcome return of normalcy to the block. Such moments, though small, carried immense weight. They signaled that the community had, in its own way, begun to heal. For Mark and Laura, the journey through this conflict had been unexpectedly arduous. It had tested their resilience, strained their patience, and forced them to confront the darker undercurrents that could surface even in seemingly tranquil settings. Yet it had also affirmed the value of standing firm, of responding to aggression not with escalation, but with principled resolve and strategic clarity. It had reinforced their belief that a community, when engaged thoughtfully and courageously, could resist the corrosive effects of fear and control. As the season turned, bringing with it the crisp air of early autumn, Mark and Laura found themselves once again looking forward to new adventures, to the simple pleasures of home and neighborhood, to the ongoing project of living well and freely. The Jeep, gleaming under the changing leaves, remained where it belonged. And though the scars of the past months would not vanish overnight, they served as a reminder of what had been endured, and what had ultimately been preserved. In the quiet streets of Chestnut Lane, normal life had returned, not by accident, but by the determined efforts of those unwilling to surrender it.